Tashale. Welcome to the Awam Tibetan Buddhist Institute and our class of the Heart Essence of Tibetan Buddhism. So just briefly, this is part 2. We are beginning today, redoing this a little bit because of some technical difficulties in the original recording of this. So first we want to take refuge. So very briefly, the wording is, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, together, please make sure your sound is off for the recording. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. So last time we did a little bit of a meditation, so this time we're doing the refuge first, and then we'll do another similar kind of a meditation to what we did in the first session last week. And so first we take a deep breath, and then out slowly. Again. And out. In. And out. You should have a sense of mental calm, peace, contentment as a part of that. Okay, so now we're going to go on with our chapter 3, starting on page 31. We got partway through the chapter last time, but we had to put off part of it in order to meet our time standards. And so here we go with this. So Buddhism is not really about meditating per se, although some people seem to view it that way. But it's a tool for attaining liberation from sufferings and so forth in our lives. And so meditating is one of the 3 main tools for training our mind. We engage in wholesome thoughts, words, and deeds, and avoid unwholesome thoughts, words, and deeds, or follow ethical guidelines. We make conscious effort to pay attention to all of these things throughout the day and even the night, sometimes even when we're asleep or in a dream state. So we have to be aware of, is it good? Is it bad? That's a very important part of the standard. So here we start with the 14 unanswerable questions. The Buddha did not have answers to everything. There are several versions of this, different versions of the same story, or perhaps similar questions from different individuals. We don't know for sure. He said that these could be answered and are therefore irrelevant to his teaching, or could not be answered, and so couldn't be relevant to his teachings. They are in 4 groups. Is the world eternal? Not, both, or neither. Is the world finite? Not, both, or neither. Is the self or soul, which oftentimes are used as kind of the same thing, but we differentiate between the two. Identical, is it identical with the body or different? And then finally, the 4th one does the Tathagata, the Buddha. Tathagata means Buddha. Exist after death, not, before, or neither, both or neither. So the 3rd of these questions relates to 2 views in Buddhism. The self is our being versus others, and may include our actions of introspection or reflexive actions, but it's about me, myself, and you. And so from my point of view, of course, that flips around from your point of view. And the soul which is sometimes, as I mentioned, used as the same as self, but in a different way. The soul is considered to be a form of existence beyond this life. And it varies according to different religions and even within branches of Buddhism itself. The Buddha's response, or lack thereof, we don't really know for sure, is often referred to as his noble silence. So instead of answering, he just didn't say anything at all. So we'll learn more about these terms later on. Next is the three turnings of the wheel. So this refers to three principal sets of teachings of the Buddha. He is said to have been given in different locations. He accepted some teachings of some teachers at that time and rejected others. He did accept karma, literally meaning actions, and especially harmful forms of actions, and dependent upon our intention. And that's a key word in Buddhism, because karma just means actions, but then it evolved into this idea of good or bad, and of course in between would be an intermediate kind of a state, but usually it's focused on either the good or the bad as a part of that. But we only have effects of that karma if it is done intentionally, and that would include both good and bad. So otherwise, it's just going to be a neutral effect. But if we do something that is harmful to someone else, for example, but it was an accident, you didn't do it intentionally, that's not going to create negative karma. Now, some people teach as if that does still create negative karma, but according to the teachings that I understand, that's not actually the case. It has to be based on our intention as a part of that. And the same would be true in good karma. You have to do things that are intentional to help others as well. So another aspect is reincarnation in various forms, change or impermanence, and nirvana, a state of deep peace, inner peace, and liberation or insight into the true nature of things, which we'll talk more about. Even joy of oneness, or a sense of unity, if you will, with reality or interdependence. The Buddha also talked about the reality, this world is everything, all of us are interdependent in one way or another. So the first turning of the wheel, another set of understandings of Buddhism, is the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, the fourth of the Four Noble Truths is, in fact, the Eightfold Path. So why do they bring that up as a separate category? It is an important one, to be sure, but raises the question about whether or not those were actually separate teachings from the Buddha. I suspect that perhaps it was, because there is evidence from some of the scholarly teachers that, in fact, originally the middle way was just that, the middle way, without any specifics. Or perhaps ethics, meditation, and insight, which is a term that the Buddha appears to have used. There's another category of things here, which we will get into a little bit later on, and that's the 12 links of dependent origination. So it's a list of 12 different things. But this list can sometimes be identified as 3 sets of things, or 2 sets of things, or maybe it's just 1 set of things in various commentaries on that. So here, the key is the 6th item in that list, which is contact. So the moment sensory experiences occur, they lead to, the contact leads to a feeling. And then from that it goes to craving, and from that it goes to clinging. So contact is a very important point. It's the point at which our sense organs, like our eyes, recognize something, such as our seeing something. And so that's a critical moment, according to the Buddha, to recognize something going on. Is it good, or is it bad, or is it neutral? And so we want to pay attention to that. The path of our desires and sufferings are a part of that, and hence the need to be aware of our experiences, as we noted earlier. In the second turning of the wheel, the Buddha went east to an area known as Vulture Peak, where he is said to have given the teachings on emptiness. The texts on this appear to be a later addition, however, as the Buddha rarely used the word emptiness itself, and when he did, he usually did it in a different way. So this turning of the wheel does include concepts of self and other that he may have given. So there are elements of that, or it might have been people taking several things together, because the philosophical view of emptiness, which it basically is, came from China. And so that was considered to be Prajnaparamita, which is the perfection of wisdom or transcendent wisdom, such as the popular Heart Sutra, which you may be familiar with, also the Diamond Sutra of Mahayana, long after the Buddha, and yet very influential in the evolution of Buddhism broadly. So not everything that is beneficial and helpful to us necessarily came from the Buddha himself, which he encouraged. The third turning of the wheel follows in reaction to the conflicts between this view as emptiness, which it literally means is nothingness and in English, but the meaning of the lack of inherent or independent existence of phenomena, including one's self. So the problem here, the emptiness being in English translation, dictionary says it's nothingness. But there are a variety of different examples. You just do a Google search and put both of those words in there, and you will find a lot of different commentaries that say that emptiness is not nothingness. Well, but that's the definition. So that is one of the things that is potentially problematic. But one of the forms of meaning for this, and the word in Sanskrit is shunyata, is the meaning of the lack of inherent or independent existence of phenomena. So that's a very different kind of thing than just emptiness itself. And so that includes the idea of oneself. So emptiness is a rather modern word from the Age of Enlightenment in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, and influencing the early USA formation, and having almost nothing at all to do with Buddhism originally. My view, you may disagree with this, but we have different points of view and understandings of this. So you can do that, and I can do this, and so we'll deal with that with each other. We don't have to have arguments or those kind of things. We can have differences in believing, as I pointed out last week. The third turning of the wheel is also said to be the middle way between the extremes of nothingness and permanence, and innate in all sentient beings, enabling all to, at some point, be liberated as a Buddha. This is referred to as our Buddha nature, as something that's said to be inherent in our heart essence, if you will. Although it's widely accepted, this is also a controversial understanding and cannot be validated by science, but it may be useful as a concept of understanding. Early Buddhist scholars find these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, even in some cases, the first to be controversial and unlikely to have been the actual teachings of the Buddha himself. We don't know for sure. The fourth noble truths likely come from the Buddha, but perhaps in a simpler manner, either as just the middle way, as I just mentioned, or the middle way as ethics, meditation, and insight, but without the Noble Eightfold Path, at least in its current form. And so some of the scholars on these ancient traditions believe that he did not have the Noble Eightfold Path as a part of his own teachings, but elements of it were there, and it eventually merged. If that was during his lifetime or not, we just don't know for sure. Next is the continuing development. The Buddha is said to have given one of his last teachings for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world. So he also said that his liberation was for the benefit of all. So that's another important part. We sometimes describe it as the two wings of a bird. On one hand is in terms of our own meditation experience of peace, mental calm, and so forth. And then the other one is what we do to help benefit others. So both of those, those represent the two wings of the bird, so to speak. Another development was the practices of Tantra. We do not know the source of Tantra, but I have included some stories in the Innate Happiness book that you can look and get a sense of what possibilities might be for the beginning and evolution of Tantra, particularly in the context of Buddhism, which we will get to later on in the course. We will examine that, and you should read the text for some background on that. One other note in this section is the growing influence of women in Indian culture. We find that this was a phenomenon that began particularly around the beginning of the first millennium, which would be about the same time as Jesus. And so what we see, the culture was changing. And part of that was an explosion in trade and people becoming more wealthy and so forth. And women were becoming more powerful in their roles in society as well. The second Buddha, after the life of the Buddha, the tradition evolved into various branches rooted in the same tree, if you will. So it all comes out of what the Buddha put together in the trunk, and then it began to branch out as other people began to teach and analyze and determine what they thought was the correct approach. But with increasing variances in those branches, by the 7th century CE, Tibet had encountered Buddhism as well, when invading China in one case and Nepal in another, during the reign of King Songtsen Gampo. So this was in the mid-600s CE. And then the century later, King Trisong Detsen in the 700s decided to construct the first monastery in Tibet. And so he invited the Shantarakshita, who was the head or abbot of Nalanda University in India at the time, and he was selected to oversee this construction, which he agreed to do. And when he came in and began the construction, what would happen? But every night, whatever was done in the daytime was torn down. Natural disasters each night. So the powerful tantric adept Padmasambhava was invited to overcome the evil spirits that were doing this, which he is said to have done, turning them into protectors. The evil spirits become protectors of the Dharma. So Shantarakshita and Padmasambhava, along with another great Indian master, Vimalamitra, became considered to be the founders of Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetans consider Padmasambhava to be the second Buddha, and later said to him to be the founder of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, to which we are at Awam belong to that particular lineage as part of that. I'll show you a little image of Padmasambhava. This will give you a sense of what we see as him. So this was followed by the second dissemination into Tibet, and King Rilbachan in the 800s was viewed as the third Buddhist king in Tibet. So those three, the first two that I mentioned and this one, King Rilbachan. He spent lavishly on temples and monasteries, etc., and ignored the matters of state. Not a good thing. He was assassinated by someone from the indigenous Bon religion who was very upset with what was going on. And King Langdharma followed him, And he was upset by some of the wealthy Buddhist supporters who came back, and he was also assassinated. So this was followed by a period ruled by the Chinese. They came into the territory and took over. The collapse of the Yang Dynasty in 905, however, left Tibet to be taken over by the Mongol Empire, which eventually lost interest. And so by 1000 CE, the Indian Buddhists were under pressure in India, and the growth of Hinduism at that time, which included a number of different things. One is the evolution of the Upanishads, which are written texts that actually started at or maybe slightly before the time of the Buddha, and the Bhagavad Gita, which was around 300 CE. We don't know exact date of that. Some say it's much earlier than that, but most scholars agree that it was around that time. So this growth of Hinduism was becoming more and more dominant as a part of that. Now remember that Hinduism is not a monastic approach, whereas Buddhism at that time was primarily a monastic approach, not entirely, but certainly a big factor. And so the support that they got from the wealthy people shifted a little bit. It was easier to provide support for the Hindu tradition than it was for the Buddhist tradition, which was much more expensive with the monastic community that it had to support. So Indian Buddhists began to move to Tibet. And one such figure was Atisha, a very well-known individual, whose disciples founded the Kadampa order. Two other major branches also emerged, the Shakyas, which rose to political dominance with the Mongols. And then later still, the Kadampa order was reorganized by Tsongkhapa as the current Gelugpa order. So I hope you can keep track of all of those. There's more information in the book. So the Gelugpa order is the order of the Dalai Lamas. So today, the 14th Dalai Lama, he's the head of that order of Tibetan Buddhism. But then it was also taken over again by the Chinese in 1950 and 51, which you're probably all familiar with. And so the current Dalai Lama escaped and fled from Tibet to India in 1959, where he still resides today. So next we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the Nyingma lineage, which is the one with which we are associated. So this is just one of the subdivisions that I just mentioned as a part of that. And so this was the earliest, the first of these lineages, is said to be originated from Samittabhadra, the primordial Buddha. There's actually a picture right over here, but I know you can't see it. And so he was considered to be the first human recipient, or from him was the first human recipient of Garab Dorje, who eventually led to Padmasambhava. And so skipping a little bit here, in addition, Yeshe Tsogyal, who was a female that became a practitioner, she was often articulated as being one of the queens of the king, but in fact, there are lists of his queen, and she's not on the list at all. In fact, there's no stories in the early history about her, so it's probably one of those stories that got embedded into it and was pushed backwards, historically speaking. But nevertheless, this was a different time and a different age. She became his most important, talking about here Padmasambhava, she was considered his most important disciple in Tibet, and recording his appropriate for their understanding and use by the people. So she wrote down these stories and teachings that he gave. These became known as termas, and it's a very popular thing. It's a hidden treasure kind of text. to be found by a designated terton or treasure revealer. I suspect that some of this may have happened with the tearing down of Buddhism, if you will. And so that probably, when they destroyed some of the temples and monasteries and so forth, I would guess that some of the monastics who were part of those took texts and hid them away, which then could have been refound sometime later as a part of it. And so I suspect that might be the original source of this idea. At any rate, the best known treasure revealers are, there's three of those, Karma Lingpa, Ratna Lingpa, and Jigme Lingpa. The best known treasure text in the West is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which you have undoubtedly heard of before, or the Bardo Todal. And then the companion text to that is the 6 Bardo teachings of Padmasambhava. And I've had that teaching a couple of times from different lamas. That text is one that then Khenchen Lama Rinpoche asked me to go ahead and teach, and I did that twice over a couple of years. But one of the things I discovered in the process of that was that it was difficult for people who didn't have a good background in these principles already to follow. It made sense in terms of the 6 Bardo teachings, but it didn't make sense in terms of the way these practices are normally taught to people in Tibetan Buddhism. So I decided to restructure that and put it in the right order. In the process, I discovered there was a few places that needed some other practices to be filled in. And so I did that. And the result of that was my book, Innate Happiness, the original edition. We're now in the 3rd edition of that. And so there's a lot of practices in the book. There's over 52 different practices in the book. So that's a key part of what the book is all about, is learning to do practices, along with some different instructions as a part of that. So it is likely that many texts were hidden away during the destruction of temples, during the persecution underlying Dharma, as I mentioned. And so the other significant features of the Nyingma tradition are Longchen Rabjam, or Longchenpa, a key figure, and Jigme Lingpa, Patrul Rinpoche, Mipam Rinpoche, Dujam Rinpoche, and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. Those are all very, very popular and well-known masters within the Nyingma tradition. The main text of the Nyingma tradition is the Guhyagarbha Tantra. And so the main practices are called Dzogchen, and then the Great Perfection or Great Completion. Either of those terms are used for describing the definition of Dzogchen. So the basics of these are included here in Innate Happiness. So we will get to these things as we work through the different practices and so forth. Now the book goes on to describe the other major branches of Tibetan Buddhism as well. We have the Kagyu, the Shakya, the Gelugpa as a part of that, but also the Bon religion, which is the indigenous religion of Tibet, but it branched into 2 parts. Sometimes referred to as the original one as the Black Bon, and then the Buddhist version of it as the White Bon. Usually today it's just called the Bon because it's following the white for the most part. Anyway, it also had a variety of influences on Buddhism, different cultural influences in Tibet, things like prayer flags, prayer wheels, fire or smoke offerings, and masks and dances and so forth. So you may be a little bit familiar with some of those kind of things as well. So they added a lot of ceremonial aspects into the practices of Tibetan Buddhism. And then another one is Jonang. The Jonang, the 5th Dalai Lama sought to get rid of them entirely. He was trying to get rid of some other ones as well. And even though he's considered to be a great master, he had this other side of himself, which was not quite so great. Anyway, the fairly recent discoveries of very isolated monasteries of this tradition have happened in very isolated areas. And the Jonang have been guardians of the Kalachakra Tantra, which you may know is one that's very popular with the Dalai Lama. He does Kalachakra empowerments fairly regularly all over the world, although he's no longer traveling all over the world. He's living and staying just in India. But I received one of those from him in India as well a few years ago. And so this is considered by some to be the highest philosophical position of all of Buddhism, called Shintang. That's based on the teachings, not just the Kalachakra, but the Jonang tradition and understanding. So the next category that we want to talk about just a little bit is the diaspora. The diaspora happened with the diaspora. I don't have that in here. Let's see here. I'll give you a couple of things. I didn't write any notes about it. But after the Chinese invasion, a lot of people, like the Dalai Lama, left China. And they spread out all over the world. And so that has led to an understanding of Tibetan Buddhism that simply didn't exist prior to that time, at least not very well. A little bit of information came out about it here and there. Some people from Europe had been able to get some information and so forth. And so it did spread around, and the scientific worldview of the West challenges some of the kind of myth and magic that's a part of that. I've mentioned that before, associated with those practices. And yeah, we're still kind of enthralled with those. The intellectual approach embraced by Tibetan Buddhism kind of attracts a lot of people as a part of that. And the idea of loving kindness and compassion also brings in a lot of people. And yet not everybody is willing or ready to embrace everything as a part of that. So one of the things that I like to say about this is that we don't have to reject what someone else says or what someone else believes. Let them believe what they want and accept that. And that doesn't mean that we have to believe it in that way. As long as it is a value to us in our life and so forth, then I think it's important to acknowledge that in people and let them do those kind of things in an accepted way by the rest of us as a part of that. And hopefully they will also recognize the views that the rest of us have that may differ based somewhat on scientific findings of these. So continuing on then, in addition to the information about those different branches, we go on then to chapter 3 and the trainings and paths. So the 3 trainings are ethics, meditation, and wisdom or insight. We've mentioned that before, but before we go into that, I want to go over something called the 4 reliances. This is a principle that is mentioned a number of times in Buddhism that can be very helpful to us as we struggle with different aspects of it. So the idea is that you want to keep this in mind as you do your study and your practice. It is very important that you don't get caught up in the words themselves, the concepts, or the ideas. It's very easy to get caught up in those. So go beyond them, see the meaning and the view of the ultimate truth. So we use that meaning to achieve transcendent wisdom through direct experience over conceptualization, a cognitive understanding. So we step back and absorb the broader understanding, and then let go of even that and abide in the suchness or heart essence. The 4 reliances are: 1, rely on the teaching, not the teacher. Okay, that's me. So don't rely on me, but what it is, it's the teaching. Rely on the meaning of the teaching, not the words that express it. So the understanding of it is words and understanding can sometimes be 2 different things. Rely on the definitive meaning, that is the ultimate aspect, not the provisional or relative meaning. Rely on the transcendent or ultimate wisdom of the deeper experience, not ordinary experience or knowledge. So we use this class to transcend that conceptuality through meditative practices. So that helps us overcome. We have to use some words, of course. You can't learn about this stuff without using some words and understanding in that way. But we also have to learn how to transcend those, get directly into the meaning and experience being articulated. So the first training in this group that I mentioned was ethics. And we've already looked a little bit at ethics, but basically it has to do with right versus wrong. There's a variety of theories about ethics, different approaches about the issue of what is right versus what is wrong. Ethics in Buddhism are not, however, rules per se. They are guidelines. And that's an important difference, a subtle difference perhaps, but an important one nevertheless. The difference is that guidelines allow for exceptions that are appropriate. Rules always encounter dilemmas when they run into exceptions. So guidelines allow for some degree of flexibility, as people will always disagree about how they interpret the intent, always choosing to have it reflect their particular bias. So that's a key word, the intent. As I mentioned before, with karma, it's based on our intent. So if our intent is to be good, even if it doesn't quite work out the way we expected, then there's still a benefit in terms of our karma, good karma. On the other hand, if something bad happens as a result but was not our intention, that doesn't create negative karma either. So there's a degree of consideration in that in terms of the effects of karma. And I think that's important, because otherwise it just becomes a black and white thing, and a lot of things are simply impossible in that way. For this reason, it's crucial to maintain the perspective on ethics of the four reliances, because those can be helpful in understanding what is good or wrong or important or not important and so forth. Otherwise, you could fall into the trap of ethical principles, particularly those of the subsequent paths to rationalize your behavior. More on that a little bit later in Tantra. The second training has to do with meditation. Having an understanding and commitment to the ethical standards of the path, you then apply to the practices themselves. Meditation in Tibetan is translated as habituation or familiarization. That's why we say you have to do these things over and over again. It has to become a habit, not just something that you pick up a text and read once in a while. Okay, so that's an important idea here. And that is to use these to transform a habitual way of seeing things in a new way. We wake to our sensory experiences for granted. We take our sensory experiences for granted as being real. But even the most basic analysis of that process blows that understanding away. Things are not the way that they appear. I look at across the way here and there's a Tanka painting. Well, it appears as a Tanka painting, but I know that that's not the true view of this. I can't see the photons that are coming into my eye and then going into and triggering the back of my eye and then creating the image of what I think is actually out there. Just one kind of form of science as a part of that. So some of these are based on more of a philosophical difference, but it also is very important in terms of understanding the principles as it relates to science. So A more scientific analysis makes it absurd, and so you can't see the photons, you can't see the atoms, you can't see black holes for that matter. And following that up with the direct experience of meditation truly transforms our view of what we call reality. But changing our understanding in the world is not something that is done overnight. It requires patience and persistence. Remember, it took the Buddha over 6 years and a great Mahasiddhas 12 or more years, even after formal training that could have lasted many years. And so patience and persistence is a phrase that we need to memorize and repeat over and over again to ourselves. So the third training is the wisdom or insight. This is not the wisdom as normally discussed in the West, where we consider it to be knowledge, expertise, or experience, but a better phrase in Buddhism is transcendent wisdom. It transcends any ordinary conception of what it might be. So it's beyond words. Again, follow the principles of the four reliances and use it to look at the tip of your finger pointing at the moon instead of looking up at the moon. So that can happen if we're not careful about it. We want to look at the moon, not the tip of the finger. Okay? So transcendent wisdom is truly ineffable, beyond words. Even the term transcendent wisdom itself is just a term. So it is achieved only via direct experience, not conceptualization. Now, the 9 vehicles of Buddhism that I mentioned a little bit when I put together the book are stages in the path that have been outlined into what is called the 9 vehicles or yanas. There are 3 primary visions within Buddhism: the Hinayana or Theravada, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. There are also 4 major schools within Vajrayana: the Nyingma, the old school, which we are a part of, the Kagyu, the Shakyas, and the Gelugpas that I also briefly mentioned. Those referred to as the new schools, if you will, or Sarma. A summary of this is that the path of individual liberation, the path of altruism, the path of Tantra, which is divided, we're going to look at more detail. So it's divided into several categories of outer versus inner. And sometimes the inner is considered to be the highest yoga tantra. You may hear that term from time to time. And then the path of great perfection, or Dzogchen, or sometimes it's called great completion. So let's just take a brief look at each of these. So the path of individual liberation is the foundation for the other 3, and the path the closest to the historical Buddha. It is also referred to as the path of renunciation, based on major focus on renouncing the desires and attachments to things in this life. So we got to get rid of those kind of cravings and desires and so forth. And of course, we replace them with something good that's beneficial as well. So the path of altruism, the next one, or sometimes referred to as the Bodhisattva path, is one who has taken the vow to remain in samsara for as long as it takes for all sentient beings to attain liberation. So we're not locked into just attaining liberation for ourselves. Now we're taking it not only for ourselves, but also for others. That becomes a very important aspect of this. So scientifically, of course, that may not be something that's very practical to do, but the principle is of great value. So again, I think we need to pay attention to the principles that are involved here. We can recognize that perhaps scientifically speaking, that may not be technically accurate, but it can be meaningful to us and can apply these things in our lives. So bodhisattvas are said to be willing to endure even suffering or unhappiness to benefit others. It is about the commitment for the well-being of others. Loving kindness and compassion. With the concept of the Bodhisattva came the development of idealized beings, referred to as yidams or Buddha forms. Some well-known of these figures are Amitabha, the Buddha of boundless light; Maitreya, the Buddha of the future; Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig, the male Buddha of compassion; Green Tara and White Tara, the female Buddhas of compassion; and Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom. In Tibetan Buddhism, these appear as peaceful yidams of the outer tantras. So the term bodhicitta, literally the heart or mind of enlightenment, including both relative and ultimate aspects. So the relative bodhicitta includes altruistic intention and action. So altruism is about our intention, which we've brought up before. So the intention to do something for others without expecting anything in return for ourselves. We will do it anyway, even if we get nothing out of it. The Buddha taught the path of individual liberation also for the benefit of others. Thus, by his example, if not by his words, he taught that to become the source of the path of altruism, the Mahayana. The Bodhisattva vow is to attain liberation for the benefit of all beings, our altruistic intent. So action bodhicitta puts our intention into practice. Later, we will learn specific practices to help with this, including the 4 immeasurables, which are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And another set, the 6 perfections, which are generosity, ethics, patience, persistence, concentration, and insight or wisdom. Of particular importance in the path of altruism are the first 5, which is often referred to as the idea of skillful means. Ultimate bodhicitta is a transcendent or non-conceptual insight. Here we abide in pure awareness, the awareness of awareness, if you will, or what scientists now call metacognition, in all activities for the benefit of all. Buddha nature is another key principle here, also called the Buddha within. It is defined as luminous emptiness. It is the clarity of transcendent wisdom or great happiness. Some branches of Buddhism treat Buddha nature as a seed that must be planted, watered, and so forth in order to grow and produce the fruit of liberation. But in the paths of Tantra and Great Perfection, you are considered to already be a Buddha. But that is hidden away by your mental obscurations and afflictive emotions, and due to your karma. It's already there, but it's hiding. The meditative paths are nearly identical in order to purify our karma, habituate ourselves in meditative equipoise, and fully realize transcendent wisdom. So the ethics, meditation, and wisdom. In the path of Tantra, the principal impact of Tantra on Buddhism was the use of yidams that I mentioned, these Buddha figures, which are considered not to be gods, although in Buddhism, all yidams are considered to be a manifestation of your mind. They are not gods. The term deities, however, literally meaning gods, is often used in translations and may be viewed as gods in some Tibetans, even some teachers. So I have gone to moving to yidam instead of calling things deities, but I've trained enough in that over time that occasionally it still pops out. But I think yidam is a more appropriate term. It has a very similar kind of a meaning, but the exception is that it doesn't really refer to gods per se. So I have found that students in the West find the characterization of yidams as a tool, if you will, or symbol or archetype idealized beings, for meditation practice to be helpful in understanding both the role of yidams in practice and their very nature in terms of training the mind. On our path of transformation into a Buddha, hence this path is sometimes referred to as the path of transformation. Tantra practices generally follow a standard plan with variations. The first part is opening prayers. Then there's a generation of the yidam, the visualization of the yidam. Then the mantra recitation. Each has a mantra, so that is recited, Om Mani Padme Hum, and similar things. Dissolution into meditation, so then that dissolves, and there's a step-by-step process of that dissolution. And then after the actual meditation part, into closing practices or prayers. The idea is to transform our impure body, speech, and mind into pure body, speech, and mind of a Buddha. You might say we practice and then role play being a Buddha when we get up off of the cushion. It's a metaphor, but it can be very helpful to us. So we think about being a Buddha during our practice, but as we get up off the cushion, we don't just turn into our old self again. We retain that sense of being a Buddha as we go about what we do. That's part of training our experience to actually become a Buddha. And it can be very effective. And we know from science that role play can be very effective in a lot of different fields. So I highly recommend that for you as well. There are 3 Buddha bodies or kayas. The Dharmakaya, truth body or heart essence, is the ultimate nature of mind, not actually a Buddha, or a body per se, but pure awareness or ultimate bodhicitta. The Sambhogakaya, or mental body, is a spirit or energy form, transparent like a rainbow. It's often described and said to be invisible to all but the most highly realized beings, or perhaps kind of like a daydream, if you will. And Nirmanakaya is the physical form body, if you will, of a Buddha, the form of Shakyamuni Buddha, for example. And then in the path of great perfection, or Dzogchen, while Yidam practices are said to enable one to achieve liberation in this lifetime, most branches of the tradition also include advanced practices. Mahamudra is one of those, the Great Seal, or Dzogchen, Great Perfection. These practices focus directly on transcendent wisdom itself. This direct approach is often referred to as the path of self-liberation. The visualizations previously employed are no longer considered necessary, although some of the actual practices still use visualizations in those advanced ones. Mahamudra and Dzogchen are directed at finalizing your attainment of liberation in this lifetime. The essence of the state of liberation is the mind of a Buddha, often articulated as a form of emptiness or awareness, which is Rigpa. The path of great perfection is divided into 2 parts, known as Trekcho, the breakthrough, or Togao, the leap over, along with a series of preliminary practices called Korde Rushan, the separation of samsara, or sufferings, from nirvana, snuffing out the sufferings or cessation. Basically, the idea is to develop a direct experiential understanding of the difference between samsara and nirvana, and then to transcend even those. So Trekcho, per se, is focused on the nature of mind, a pure awareness, as I mentioned, or Rigpa. That is the awareness that arises before becoming aware of anything. Remember contact, that point of contact in the 12 links? There's the key right there. The goal of Trekcho is to direct realization of Dharmakaya. So that's our goal, right to Dharmakaya. And then Togao is most noted for the 4 visions of Togao, which you may have heard of, with a practice called sky gazing. that involves looking at clear, cloudless sky in which the visions appear without any external source from which to generate them. They just appear in the clear blue sky. The goal is attainment of a rainbow body, the manifestation of a Sambhogakaya, or mental body of a Buddha. And now, just briefly about the teacher and devotion, chapter 4. It's important to understand the idea of devotion to the teacher. It's a significant feature of Tibetan Buddhism, although it does raise questions at times about ethical considerations. For all practical purposes, they are the Buddha for us, our role model, if you will, as well as our teacher. They provide guidance and help us in the inevitable difficulties and questions that arise. Thus, to be effective, we need a very special relationship with our teacher. It is said that if you see a teacher as a Buddha, you will receive the benefits of instructions from a Buddha. If you see the teacher as just a teacher, you will receive benefits of a teacher. And if you relate to your teacher as an ordinary human, you will receive the blessing of an ordinary human. It's all in your mind. So teacher qualifications, be sure to read this in the book. There's a much more lengthy text on that, as well as examples, detailed examples of that. But in summary, finding the right teacher can be a challenge. We probably don't have personal access to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I don't. But teachings are online commonly today. Even we are doing that. The number of books in English, the internet have become vast reservoir of access to various resources and sometimes teachers. And so several lists of qualifications are in the book, things to avoid that have been included there from Patrul Rinpoche that were basically identified in The Words of My Perfect Teacher, a very classical text that is written by him, and that may be helpful. And then the devotion in Buddhism is not blind faith. The Buddha encouraged us to question what we taught. Nevertheless, it does require a willingness to try it out. You will never know whether the teachings will help you unless you follow the instructions of the teacher. But if you are unable to find the right teacher, Buddhism has an answer for that as well, of course. First, Padmasambhava, the guru that I showed you, the little statue there, Guru Rinpoche, is considered to be the universal teacher for all tantric practitioners. And so if you have not been able to find your root guru in human form, consider Padmasambhava to be your root guru, at least until you make a special personal connection with someone. In addition to the outer teacher, we are endowed with the Buddha nature in our inner teacher. We all have that inner Buddha nature we talked about. Even more important, though, is the teaching, not the teacher, as previously noted in those 4 reliances. So the teaching, the signs of devotion include devotion to the Lama in whatever form is considered to be critical to your progress, as best done in your daily practice, as well as, you see later often, include daily preliminary practices such as prostrations to the Buddha and so forth, or standing when your teacher enters the room, through the most, although most wave it off these days. Other considerations include view practices and transmissions that are listed in our book for your consideration. So take a look at those. Primarily, it is a consideration of respect for our teachers. So next week, we will take a look at the path of individual liberation. There's 3 chapters in the book on that. And so please take a look at those, read them, and don't forget you can email me if you have questions, and I can either email back to you or we can talk about them if we have time in the presentations as well in order to share it with everyone. So again, Please abide softly and deeply in pure awareness with love and kindness and compassion for all beings, always and always. Thank you very much for being with us today and look forward to seeing you again.